So before we go on with this talk, I just want to clarify a couple of things. Just to get this out of the way, I'm not here to try to convince you to make your code style consistent throughout your code base. I'm here to share with you the history of code style at Shopify. We'll go through things that worked and things that didn't work for us. So if you decide to do a similar effort, you can tackle some of those issues before they even come up for you. So let's go back to the beginning of our story. Our first Git commit dated 2005, and it was made by our CEO and founder, Toby. It all actually began in 2004, though, in SVN. Over those 13 years, we can notice two things. We have a lot of code. I'll show you this image so you can sink in a little bit how many lines of code we have. But the most important number here is that today we have over 700,000 lines of code in Ruby. The second thing is that we have over 400 Rails developers working at Shopify, and the majority of those are actually working our main code base. If we look at our repo, over those 12 years in GitHub, we had contribution from over 800 people. They come from different departments, so not only developers, but also content writers and designers also write some code for Shopify Core. And we're growing our team constantly. So what does this mean for code style consistency? You probably heard that Shopify is one of, if not the biggest Rails shop in the world today. And so we have some pretty unique problems to tackle on a daily basis, and we have to come up with a lot of creative solutions to solve those problems. Keeping 700,000 lines of code consistent has been a pretty wild job, but why? The first question that we had to ask ourselves was, do we want to make the code style, our code base consistent? Imposing a single code style actually goes against what the Ruby language was designed for. In an interview, Matt, the designer of the Ruby language, said that the intention of Ruby is actually to allow for creativity and to allow a user to choose what works best for them, unlike other languages that impose a very specific way of doing things. At the same time, Ruby has changed and evolved a lot. Some styles no longer work, and some are just not used anymore at all. To exemplify this, we can look at this hash rocket syntax that has been mostly replaced by a new way of doing it. All of this relates back to the fact that Shopify was never rewritten in those 13 years. And in this lies the issue that all of those outdated styles are still part of our code base today. So it makes it very old-fashioned, but at worst, it's very inconsistent. So let's dive into some history here. Our codebase was born in 2004. It was a new app using a new framework, and it only had a very few developers working on it. At this point, nobody really cared or had to care about code style and having a consistent code base. Only in 2012, we actually looked again at code style. We had a lot more developers, and it was a lot bigger, and the code base was already aging. So Toby, our CEO, decided that we needed to create a draft style guide that people, with only a half dozen rules that people could look at to kind of start the process of making it a little bit more consistent. Until 2014, nothing more was done around that. So in September 2014, we introduced the RubyConf gem to our code base to deal with very basic code style rules, such as white spaces. If you don't yet know RubyConf, it is an open source Ruby gem that analyzes your code statically and it serves as a linter following many of the code styles defined by the community for the community. While the intention was great, this is what happened. We had an already big code base, 10 years worth of code, that had never been linted, and it had a lot of violations. So it all exploded. Many rules were then disabled because it was not feasible to correct all of those violations at the same time. Instead of running RubyConf through the entire code base, we needed to find another solution to stop the bleeding, to fix things that were yet to be implemented so that they had the right style. We needed something that would only look through code that was being changed or new code being added. This is when a new gem called Policio came about. So Policio was created by a Brazilian, so you can actually, it's called Policio, but people keep saying Polisho, so we call it Polisho now. So Polisho is a wrapper built around RubyConf that only runs on pull requests and accuses code style violations in code that was added or changed. It was inspiring the how tool made by ThoughtBot, but adapted to Shopify's needs and constraints. Polisho listened to events using GitHub webhooks, and whenever a pull request was created, it would comment on the pull request with any code style violations that it found. The team was not very impressed with that. The tool was very, very noisy. It added a lot of comments in the pull request, and despite the noise, they continued using it, but that meant we were in for a lot of improvements in the tool. October 2015 was quite an eventful month for us in the code style front, where 2 new big changes came about. Looking for other solutions, we thought about using commit status API in GitHub instead of commenting on chosen pull requests to convey code style violations. Much like a CI status, the Polisho status changes depending on whether you found any violations in your pull request or not. So if no violations were found, it would be green, like it's shown here. And if you did find some violations, however, it would turn red, and you could click in the details button to show a list of all the violations in your pull request. It would bring you to this page where you can see all of the style violations and the lines where they occur, details on what the violation is and how can you fix it. This feature was opt-in for our developers at that time, so you could choose as a developer whether you wanted to use the tool or not. Even though the tool wasn't perfect, we saw great adoption rates. Almost 50%, over 50% of our developers actually chose to use this tool for their day-to-day coding. And the second thing that changed that month was that along with our Polisho app, the Shopify Ruby style guide came to life, describing more detail our style preferences, what our style preferences were. With that, the rules would violate the code styles described in our style guide were now added to the list that were actively being investigated in pull requests. This is how our style guide looks like. The guide was meant to set expectations for our Ruby developers, not only in terms of code style, but also how they're encouraged to take ownership of their code and decide for themselves when exceptions to the guide are reasonable. So one of the many complaints we had is that like, oh, this rule doesn't fit very well here, it doesn't make it readable. So we wanted to encourage people to make decisions and say like, if it doesn't work well here, that's fine, you can do it in a way because the end goal is readability. More important than those expectations, the guide offers plenty of examples of what matches our code style and what doesn't. So it removes any guessing necessary when people are writing code. So this is one of the examples that is in our style guide. A few months into these changes, a survey was sent out to all of developers at Shopify to find out the good, the bad, the ugly of Polisho and the style guide we had implemented so far. I'll share some of those findings with you. Most developers had felt that the role Polisho was playing was a beneficial one to our development. Developers felt like they were learning from Polisho and having those style violations being explicitly shown to them and how the style guide was written. And again, with an overwhelming positive response, devs thought Polisho was bringing value to our code base. So we also looked at some very specific feedback. Some negative feedback was that the rules were unclear, it wasn't clear how those rules improve our code base, it was really confusing how different projects could implement and choose different rules to go on their code base. And a very common feedback revolved around pull requests now taking longer to get merged because they would have to clean up and ask for more rounds of reviews. But more daunting than that was that people complained of it making files less readable. And we were like, how is that even possible? So since Polisho would only search for violations in lines of code that were being changed or were newly added, it created some inconsistency, like you can see here, on line 2 and 3, where an existing line that was not changed for a while might have had some old style, and a new line right after that would have some new updated style. So then it makes it less readable, which is opposite to the effect that we actually wanted to achieve. On the positive side, we had some awesome feedback too. Some thought that the enforced style made the code more readable, more predictable, and it made it a lot easier for developers for new developers to onboard, especially ones that were not coming from Ruby development before. It allows the developers to focus on more thought-intensive tasks like writing and reviewing patterns and logic in code and not having to focus on style. With such a great response, we went ahead and activated Polisho to investigate all pull requests for the Shopify Codebase. Other apps could also be set up to use it as well. Given the not-so-perfect nature of the tools that we were using at that time, Polisho was set up to not fail a build, and pull requests could be merged even though it had code style violations. This wasn't great because developers were like, I don't want to fix this, so I'm just going to merge it, whatever. But most didn't. And it was useful to not have it that way at that time because if we had any emergency, it was easy to merge, that we had to fix something really quickly. It was really easy to merge something without having to fail the CI and then having to go back and fix the violations and so on, especially because they were not being auto-corrected at the time. So our first phase was done. We had Polisho running to catch all future violations. Part 2 was ahead of us though, fixing violations that were already in our 10-year-old code base so that these rules could fail the build in CI if any new violations were added. Now acquainted with the Polisho and RubyConf, we took the effort some steps further. Some files were entirely manually corrected so that certain rules could be enabled in CI, failing the build if new violations were added to those files specifically. Some of these rules are auto-correctable. Like replacing double quotes by single quotes is a very easy fix that can be done automatically, but some rules cannot be auto-corrected, like breaking a line into a smaller length. And we decided to use the tools we had also to improve other parts of our development effort. At this time, our team was working on upgrading Rails to Rails 5.0 and removing all of the deprecations, and they soon realized the developers were adding new deprecations in, which would make the work much harder. So we created custom rules to prevent people from adding new deprecations to the code. So we kind of steered a little bit how we were using the tool to work for us in a different way. One example of a Rails rule is this one that you can see on the screen that checks if behaviors were being added directly to framework classes, but instead should be using the onload hook provided by the framework. This rule was auto-correctable, so it was very useful for developers and very quickly to fix. With the success we saw so far, we were ready to run it through the entire code base. We had a perfect plan. So the step 1 would be, we first run all the auto-correctable rules through the entire code base. We did it. You can see here. Step 2 would be picking a time when there's the least amount of people deploying code so that we could merge all those pull requests that I showed you before with minimal conflict. So we chose the weekend after we were doing this, because weekends are normally a time when there's not a lot going on. Step 3 would be let's inform all the developers before they murder all of us, because they will have a million conflicts on Monday when they come back to work. So that way we told them to close all their merge their pull requests before the weekend. Step 4, we merge all the pull requests, and then we would have a linted code base. Yay! No, did not happen. Sorry. Why did it not happen? It was the perfect plan, in theory. Why did we not go through it? We came across some blockers. So the first one that people were really scared about is that it would break Git history, which means it would be harder to do because the code style fix, those commits would now be basically staining the history by adding things that were not necessarily related to functionality of the code that was there. And also at Shopify, we believe in something, one of our values is ownership. And that means that whatever code you touch, you own it. If I merge those pull requests, my name would be in the entire code base, so I would get pinged all day long for all sorts of weird problems that were not related at all to the thing that I was doing, which is just changing single codes. So this makes that it wasn't feasible for these 1 or 2 people who were actually doing it. We came to really understand what a week in Shopify-time actually meant. I shared this, our VP of engineering shared this tweet about how many times we build Shopify a day and how many times we deploy. And so a week time is enough for a massive amount of code to change. And we did the pull requests in 1 weekend. By the next weekend, we had to pretty much redo all of them because a lot of code has changed and we had so many conflicts that it was like, we should have just done it this weekend. We were definitely not ready. So we closed all the pull requests, we closed the issue, and on to give it some more thought. Our problems were all still there. Policia was working, the code was becoming more consistent slowly, but by no means were the tools making work easier for our devs. Some of our issues were, we were enforcing rules that were not necessarily clear or that didn't seem as beneficial. All the rules were enabled by default, and then we would just disable the ones that we didn't want or that caused too much controversy. To minimize the frustration among our devs, we followed Rails steps and changed our strategy to only run rules that we actually wanted by default. This new strategy allowed us to discuss whether we should add a new rule to our style guide instead of discussing whether we should remove one that already existed. In January this year, GitHub added a new feature that allows you to easily look at the history of a single line, and that came to be a very important feature that led us to our next try. So if you don't know the feature, that's how it works. It takes you back on history very easily. And a few months had passed. The new strategy for the rules were working quite well. Developers were a lot more receptive to having a style guide, and they were more confident that while the journey hasn't been all unicorns and butterflies, we were getting to a better place. So we were ready to try again and use RubyConf's autocorrect feature to fix all violations through the entire code base. This time we were using a bot, so no one would be paying for owning the entire code base. This is what a pull request looks like. For the violations that were already auto-corrected, the -A RubyConf flag was added to our internal development tool so developers can easily auto-correct their code before pushing it, knowing that any new style violations were actually introduced by them because we had already cleared the entire code base. This allowed us to add each of the rules that were being auto-corrected to our test suite so that the build fails when new violations were added. So here's a list of all the ones that we have fixed so far. Of course, we had a major setback. One of our biggest issues we found when adding new rules to our test suite was that linting our code base was taking more time than our slowest tests. We temporarily fixed this issue by removing huge migration files from the files being inspected, and it was not a long-term solution, but it allows us to continue doing it for the time being. Some components on our code have been completely linted and are now fully being checked at build time. So where are we at today, and where do we need to get to? We currently have 2 RubyConf configuration files, one for all auto-correctable violations being forced in CI and breaking builds if you add new violations, and one for all of the other rules that are optional, that you will show you in Policia if they're broken, but if you don't fix it, it doesn't matter. In the future, we want to go back to having only one RubyConf definition with all the rules being checked in CI, so you can no longer merge if you have added new violations. Each developer has to run RubyConf autocorrect command locally before pushing their pull request, which is frustrating. So why should we do something that the computer can do it by itself without us actually having to do it ourselves? So our goal is to enable autocorrect when a dev pushes a pull request. So instead of making the build fail, the bot would make a commit in the pull request, applying all of those fixes that it can autocorrect automatically. Developers are very impatient creatures, as you probably might know. So linting can possibly take longer than running tests. So we are implementing some caching strategies to improve the performance when all rules are enabled in our test suite. A lot of the issues that we encounter are new, and while we tackle them, it's important that we also push them upstream so that the community can also benefit from having improved tools. And also a continuous improvement to our guides gives more context and clarity to our preferred styles, and it allows developers to make better informed decisions as well. So I'll share with you some final takeaways for this talk, and just to close it up. Having a place where all developers in the company can ask questions about your guide when the rules are not obvious or are not clear or they don't know why they exist, which will bring me to my next point. In many places, RubyConf allows you to choose which style to use in a given rule. Study your code base, talk to your colleagues, decide on which ones are right for your project. So this is an example from the RubyConf documentation, because Ruby is a language that should be flexible enough for you to use it in the way that works best for you. So the community style guide, and the Ruby Linter allow you to make these calls and decide on what's best for your project and your code base. So you don't have to decide, like, because I do it that way, you don't have to do it that way. You can do it in a different way if that's what you're more used to or works best for your project. The process of bringing a code base to consistency is not an easy one, especially in a community that values creativity in code so dearly. Allow for discussions to happen. Not all rules will work for all code bases, and it's important to allow for those to surface and for people to discuss them. Your tools have to be somewhat functional, and your developers at least partially on board for this change to be successful. But keep at it. It's not an easy process. There will be people who are going to be against it and are going to be complaining about it all the time, but don't be put down. The time is never going to be perfect. Once it's good enough, don't give up. Talk to others. Learn more about your tools, and so that you know what you can and cannot do, and tackle one problem at a time. Most importantly, have fun. Thank you very much. Gracias.